Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and I've brought together the three people who didn't vote for the Republican Party in the United... No, I brought together three distinguished guests to do what we've planned for months, which is to talk about the US general election, as it's called, what happened and why and what it implies. And I'd like my guests to introduce themselves now.
Hi there, I'm Nolan Higdon. I'm a lecturer at University of California, Santa Cruz, and a contributor to Project Censored and The Edge at the Park Center for Independent Media.
I'm Robin Andersen, and I'm Professor Emerita of Media Studies at Fordham University, and I taught that for a long time. And now I'm just a writer and a commentator. And I just finished a book on the media coverage of Gaza, and I will continue publishing an Al Jazeera column that is translated into Arabic, which I think is kind of interesting and fun.
And hi, I'm Steve Macek. I'm a professor of communication and media studies at North Central College in the Chicago area. I'm also a contributor to Project Censored.
Well, thanks to all three of you. And the way I wanted to start things is because I read today an extremely stimulating column by Nolan, which says that the Democratic National Committee is wonderful. The Blue Dogs set the tone for all of us to see a Pacific Socialist revolution, and the Clintons and the Obamas are wonderful people. Did I read that correctly, Nolan?
I think you missed a couple things there, Toby, but you got the gist of it. Yeah, yeah. I wrote this piece in a response to what I was sort of surprised to see, which was so many Democrats surprised to see the outcome of the election. And this piece was published over at The Edge. It's titled "The Price of Comfort: How Corporate Media Left Democrats Blindsided in 2024 Again." And the piece is basically talking about how media covered the election. And if you were in the Democratic Party or blue bubble, you got a lot of coverage of how bad Trump was. A lot of that coverage was accurate. His felony charges, January 6th, the sexual assault and harassment accusations against him, his racist statements, his association with racist people, and on and on and on. But that was also coupled with a lot of really laudatory coverage of Harris and her campaign, talking about the huge rallies and how she's spreading joy and vibes, and she's collecting $1 billion, and she's rubbing shoulders with all these celebrities and in these big events. And it gave a lot of, I think, liberals and Democratic Party voters a misconception about how effective the Harris campaign was being and how popular Democrats were. And I think it also concealed the groundswell of working class support for Trump, and also the opposition to Harris, particularly from uncommitted voters over Gaza who were threatening to either stay home or vote for Trump. A lot of that stuff was not getting in the blue bubble. And I think this is why so many folks got caught off guard. What's sort of frustrating about all that is if you watch conservative like legacy media like Fox or OAN, Newsmax, they were actually giving a lot of kind of substantive critiques of Harris that you couldn't get in lefty media. And it's in addition to some ridiculous critiques of Harris, but some of the ones were things that are largely out of Harris's fault, but affected the campaign. The fact that Biden held on too long, the fact that Harris didn't go through a primary and get to hone like her message or her relationship or her skills or build a campaign. She had to use the dying Biden campaign while she was building a campaign and doing a campaign for 100 days. Well, Trump, on the other hand, has been campaigning for like 9 years in this space. So you got that, but also I think the real pivotal change for Republicans was they had this new media space, and Trump rightly recognized that most audiences are in the podcast, social media space, and he went there and he spread that message. Harris tried to a degree, but she doesn't have as many hardened supporters. The left doesn't have a really well-established new media space. The left that does new media space that does exist, sometimes called like the prog left or dirtbag left, it's really defined by its opposition to the Democratic Party. And as a result, if you go in that space, you will hear some support for collectivists and progressive ideas, but you'll hear a lot of critiques of the Democratic Party. And as a result, Harris and most Democrats don't go into that space. So they miss that opportunity to reach that larger audience. I think that's a negative effect on the left. And then just kind of in closing in the piece, I mentioned that everything I just described is really easy to describe because we were told in 2013 and 2014 by folks like Bernie Sanders that this was going to happen, that if we didn't have a working class agenda in the Democratic Party, we'd lose him to the right. He was dismissed as anachronistic, an FDR type thinker, and it's only white people. You don't understand. The race of the country is changing. Well, now we see people of color from the working class dramatically shifting over to Trump as well. There were people like Nader and others who told us 20 years ago this story. So for me, it was a piece that I wrote, not necessarily to just rag on the Democratic Party, although there's plenty of that, but to also say, like, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. If you want a different election, don't sit at home and watch the channel that encourages you to just bash on Trump and MAGA. Watch a channel that gives you a much closer to an unvarnished interpretation of the Democratic Party and the state of the electorate. And that's my sort of plea with the left side of the spectrum out there. You got to turn off the Rachel Maddow's of the world and start doing some serious soul searching and looking for facts and information.
Rachel Maddow, PhD, MSNBC talking head program host. Nolan, thanks a lot. Steve and Robin, would you maybe like to respond or add something?
I wanted to just sort of dovetail off what Nolan said. I think I agree that the biggest blunder the Democrats made was not listening to Bernie Sanders. So in the closing days of the Harris campaign, she was out campaigning with a bunch of Republicans, with Liz Cheney and other conservatives in a like a like a foolhardy attempt to attract moderate Republicans. So instead of trying to appeal to likely Democratic voters, that is to say, working class voters, she instead tried to appeal to like suburban soccer moms who are completely okay with what Joe Biden is doing in supporting Israel, destroying, committing genocide in Gaza, but maybe have concerns about the elimination of the right to an abortion, right? Like that. Those are the people that the Harris campaign chose to target, and that was a huge mistake. I don't think that Trump actually attracted many new voters. I think the evidence is he got like 74 million votes. Back in 2020, he got 75 million maybe this time. So he didn't really increase the number of votes. He just mobilized the people he knew supported his agenda. On the other hand, Harris got only something like, I mean, and they're still counting the vote, I know, in California. So it may turn out to be a little bit closer, but she only got like 72 million votes. As opposed to Joe Biden, who got something like 81 million back in 2020. So she lost ground, and where did she lose ground? Precisely with working class voters. And I think that's because she chose not to campaign with union leaders who supported her, like Sean Fain at the UAW and others. I do think that she was working at, I think what Nolan said about the fact that she had to sort of wait to jump into the race because Joe Biden insisted on campaigning for president, that there was no primary. That actually worked against her. So if you look at the approval ratings of Trump and Harris, right before the election, Harris actually had a slightly higher approval rating than Donald Trump, yet managed to lose the election. That's the other thing that indicates that she wasn't able to mobilize people, right, who actually supported her. Trump has never had an approval rating over like 44% ever in his in his life. Harris had a very abysmally low approval rating in the 30% back when Joe Biden was running for president. If this in 2024, as soon as he left the race, her approval rating started to go up. So but she was, I would argue, weighed down by the albatross, the negative halo of the opinion that people had of Joe Biden. But I kind of concur wholeheartedly with the gist of your analysis that like the Democrats have to stop listening to inside the Beltway, liberal media and inside the Beltway corporate liberal political consultants, and actually practice real democracy. I mean, we are here where we are right now and I'm going to let Robin speak. We are here where we are right now, I would argue, because the Democratic Party engineered the victory of Hillary Clinton in the primaries in 2016. We know from the WikiLeaks Clinton campaign leaks, that the Democratic National Committee was colluding with the Clinton campaign to ensure that Bernie couldn't mount this socialist insurgent candidate, couldn't mount a challenge to her candidacy. Now, I'm not saying he would have won anyway if it was a fair and even process, but it absolutely wasn't a fair and even process. And that's what resulted in Trump's victory in 2016, and sort of, I think you can say it's ultimately responsible for him returning in 2024. Go ahead, Robin. Sorry, I'm
Well, there's
ranting.
a lot to say about the past campaigns and how they thwarted the Biden administration in terms of his economic policies. But right now, I'd like to go back to Kamala Harris. I think we should come around to that, though, back to it. Kamala Harris had to get a lot of votes out. She had to win this popularity contest because Biden's numbers had fallen to like sub-zero, if you recall, and she's the vice president. So she had to really, there was all this enthusiasm when we all breathed a sigh of relief when Biden finally stepped down and Harris stepped up to the spotlight. The funders came in, and I think that was what maybe one of the things that got Biden forced to step down, is because his funders were starting to back out. But the funders is also probably what did Harris's campaign in as well, because what she did is the same thing that you guys have talked about, is track to the center, instead of appealing to working class and young people's votes. And she couldn't do anything with that, especially since she had a very superficial media-driven campaign. So this kind of enthusiasm of joy and unity, right? Do you remember that? Where there was even this flower power poster where Kamala was like dressed around in flowers and stuff. And at the Republican convention, excuse me, the Democratic convention, there was this don't, okay, those terrible protesters are out in the street, as people like drove past in the bus and looked at them with disdain and clapped when the cops took the protesters away, who were protesting, of course, against genocide and against funding Israel. So they didn't allow a Palestinian on the Democratic convention floor. But back to Kamala's extremely unthoughtful, unvisionary, media-driven campaign that had no substance. Kamala, and the best of instances, is not that great of a coherent speaker, and that's why she got so popular on social media, right? With the coconuts for Kamala, because the young people make memes out of the little fun things she used to say. But there wasn't a vision there. And without a kind of a grounding in a vision that she could articulate, nobody knew what to do with this. You couldn't bring this enthusiasm to a party that really had to have enthusiasm at that point. I of course, I've been writing about Gaza, so I don't know if I'd like to start talking about Gaza right now, if that's okay, about how that influenced. So we kind of know she didn't appeal to the working class, but what we do solidly know is that a majority of the American people have been against the genocide and calling for a ceasefire, almost, certainly by the end of 2023, and that the war was very unpopular. Okay, so shortly before the election, Michael Moore wrote that plead in an open letter to Kamala to please, you can win the swing states, which she was polling in the swing states 50 over, she could have gotten back to the numbers of Arab and Muslim Americans who voted for Biden in the 70 percentiles in Michigan and other swing states, had she just done something to tell these people, many of them in Dearborn and places had family members in Israel, in the middle, in Palestine, in the Middle East, in Gaza, in Lebanon, and they're sitting there watching this and grieving for their families, and the psychological burden of that. Some of them in an exit poll said, I didn't care if there was a 99% chance that Trump was going to continue the policies. I'm going to take that 1% chance because we know that there's no even 1% chance with this administration to stop the genocide and stop funding Israel. So we know that, but I just want to make one more point about this kind of larger atmosphere, cultural and political and psychological atmosphere, if you will, of an administration. Now, if you recall, Biden ran on common decency and a center. That was his message in the 2020 campaign largely. And look at what he did. He leveraged Palestinian lives in this loyalty to Israel. He's helped them kill what will be, come on, let's face it, hundreds of thousands of people. Now, finally, as the ethnic cleansing of northern Gaza is being carried out, right at the time when there was an election. The psychological burden of that knowledge of even people who don't watch social media, you knew that even I mean, I just wrote a book about the media coverage of Gaza, and they justified and condoned, and in the middle of the mainstream, you're talking about the blue dog Democrats and their media allies, condoned and did all of that stuff. But nevertheless, people know that we've been slaughtering children, that Israel could not be killing children and in body bags, in the tearing them up in that set. That burden psychologically is hard to bear. And it's going to be expressed in people's voting, in nihilism, in disheartening. They're not going to come out. But and the young people aren't going to come out. And those that do vote are going to say, I'm going to do anything to get out of this, man, to get out of this psychological terror. So sorry to be such a downer, but that's how I see. Because so much of the post-election was, it wasn't Gaza. That was only a small part of it. And then, I've been trying to kind of put my finger on it, and finally a few columnists have come out and they've actually made this argument, one in the Guardian and one in Dissent magazine, and they've said, this horrible blight, when Biden was the kind of bringer of a center of global stability and a rules-based order to foreign policy, that has just been now smashed. And one of the polls of young people, the pollster, like what is his name, Deadline and Semaphore published it, and this has been the best thing that a lot of us have been quoting the last few days, is that young people believe that it's a dying empire overall, with the questions that they asked and the response they got. Basically, young people believe it's a dying empire run by bad people. And you can't get out and vote enthusiastically for anybody that. And the threat of Donald Trump paled by comparison to what the Biden administration was already doing.
Getting back to a point Nolan made about the newer media and the Democrats' obsession with middle-aged and elderly media. If we go back to Howard Dean's candidacy for the presidency from the governorship of Vermont, and then to Obama's two campaigns, the newer media was seen as something the Democrats had a lock on. They were good at, they were interested, they were inside it, they were on top of it, all those overused and unfortunate metaphors and similes, and the Republicans didn't have a clue. Now we're getting the obverse of that, and we're being told that, Joe Rogan is the spirit of the United States, Trump knows how to talk into machines that are newer than the ones he used to talk into, and so on. And I wondered whether that story about an early domination by the Democrats, going back 15 or 20 years was right? And if it's right that it's changed, how on earth did that happen?
Yeah, I would. I'll take a stab at answering that question first. And I think two great sources for this that I'd recommend are Ben Smith's book Traffic and Angela Nagle's book Kill the Normies. I think those are two great books that talk about this, but they speak to what you're saying there, Toby, that the left in general, but the Democrats in particular, did a really good job of figuring out things like early uses for like email blasts and email lists and social media, particularly the Obama campaign, were really, ahead of their time in that. To the point, I think even Obama, now looking back, didn't really use social media to the extent he could, but it was impressive at the time, knowing what we know. But the reason why I cited those books is both talk about how the infrastructure of like new journalism, new digital media, and social media were predicated on this idea that the way you survive is by capturing traffic. You get the most attention possible paid to you. And there was a debate. Some people thought traffic was earned by high quality content. Other people thought, no, traffic is something you extract. You basically put whatever up there you have to get people's attention, right? The clickbait, HuffPost, headlines, things like that. And we look back at pioneers in that space like Huffington Post and Gawker and these kind of folks. But what Ben Smith points out in Traffic is there was a lot of the future right-wing personalities and right-wing media were part of creating that. Look at Andrew Breitbart was heavily involved in that. The Tim Pools of the world, the Dave Rubins, these folks were heavily involved in the creation of this media space. And what they eventually figured out was, okay, we've got the traffic down. We don't like this lefty liberal message. Let's tie these traffic principles to conservative messages or critiques. And it blew up. And they had a candidate in Donald Trump who really understood how to legitimize these spaces. He talked to Alex Jones. He talked to Breitbart. If there was insane conspiracies online that most like people in academic world or media ignored, Trump talked about them. That forced the media to talk about them, and that forced us in like the higher ed media analysis space to talk about them. He was a genius at doing that. And so that transition that took place was the left created this traffic for politics, and the right was able to take it, rebrand it, and use it for political success, while the left's response was, well, it's all fake news in the digital space. We got to ignore this stuff. We got to moderate it. We got to censor it. And that was the wrong reaction, as 2024 shows.
Can I just chime in? I think part of what's happened is also that many of the owners and founders of these new media platforms, take Facebook and Instagram, Mark Zuckerberg, take the platform formerly known as Twitter, X, owned by Elon Musk, right? So many of them started out on the left and identified as liberals. They were pledging to give away billions and billions of dollars to address, pressing social needs. They wanted to eliminate poverty and so on. And then they all sort of underwent this makeover. And now many of them, like Zuckerberg, identifies himself as a libertarian. He made a bunch of algorithmic changes in the past year to Instagram and Facebook to de-emphasize political posts, which I think, kind of muted the, left wing and liberal and woke voices on those platforms. And then, of course, Elon Musk bought Twitter, and turned it into a font of right-wing conspiracy theories and propaganda, and as openly campaigning for Donald Trump. So I think the media ownership still matters. I mean, we can talk all about technology and the way it's changed relations in the public sphere between content creators and consumers. It absolutely has. It's lowered the bar and allowed more voices to be part of an ongoing discussion. But at the same time, ownership still matters. And ownership has never been more right wing, I would argue, of both legacy and new media than it is today. And that, I think, is a big part of why Donald Trump is heading back into the White House.
Robin, do you have thoughts on this? Because I wanted to jump in a minute on something related, but would love to hear what you think.
Sure. In 2016, Trump used social media, and Nolan, you used the word genius for Trump, and I think that is actually pretty apropos in the way that he did use and continues to use social media. What was he serving up McDonald's in an apron on as his, and that was on social media. And um and I did see a wrap up of the election that criticized Kamala Harris for not using social media and sticking to their. And you were so right to say this media bubble that they were all because we know that propaganda affects those that send it out because censorship is part of that, and you only hear that message. And when you hear yourself say it over and over again, you start to believe it, and clearly they did. But in 2016, Donald Trump also he used it to appeal to multiple publics as well, so he could get to his ultra right, what we called it, alt-right base at that point, 2016. Remember that word? And he wore that. There was him speaking at a lectern, and he substituted his head for that green frog on 4chan, which was Pepe the Frog. And he had, he always would wear swastikas and the German Nazi cap from World War II, and so much of the iconography that Trump used was on social media in 2016, and he could say those things and get that out without and that's when they started talking about normies, that you could kind of reach the normies with these icons that didn't have to elaborate on what their politics were, but just under cool images that looked kind of, maybe somewhat harmless, but a little edgy. And you could kind of cover up you could send that message to your base while at the same time reaching normies. And that's what his, I think, genius was in 2016. And nobody caught on to that. Meanwhile, he's the content of a lot of the stuff at Breitbart and all that stuff was that same anti-immigration, ultra-right, anti-foreign, basically hate speech.
Now, I had a question about Julia Roberts. Did any of you guys see the Julia Roberts commercial or the voiceover that she did? It was in the last few days before the election. It's become quite infamous. She does a voiceover of two white women going into the booths to vote. And there's a woman whose hand is gravitating over Biden, Harris, or Trump. And Julia says, this is one of the few places left in America where a woman's choice matters, where she can actually decide things for herself. She votes for Harris, she walks out, and her dipshit white dude husband says, did you do the right thing, honey? And she says, sure did, or words to that effect. So this was meant to get at the sort of mythic Republican wife who is going to disobey daddy because of abortion issues, right? And lots of people have said, rightly or wrongly, that this didn't work. It alienated ordinary women, ordinary in inverted commas, and it did so for two reasons. The first reason is, and we all know there's social science on this, celebrities are not effective in getting people to adopt political positions. They're effective at getting people to buy coffee or wine. And secondly, the abortion issue appears actually not to have worked for the Democrats in the way they imagined, partly because of the plebiscites that have gone through, the laws that have not gone through, and partly because Trump managed to be Bill Clinton on the issue. So, sorry, this is not really a question. It's a long-winded question, if that at all. What about this issue then of Julia Roberts and the commercial, but also women and the vote? Because this is one of the big changes that's happened, along with the fact that, the suburban, urban, rural divisions have become stronger, and the people with degrees, people not with degrees have become stronger. in terms of what the exit polls said. So it's a big catch-all question in a way. Robin.
I'll give it a start. That was actually a political directive from a high-up person in the Trump team. It wasn't J.D. Vance, but I'm trying to think of who said it, but they said women should vote the way their husbands voted. So they were actually addressing that anti-Trump message of theirs. They did a lot. That they did a really bad campaign commercial where they also targeted that same message to men. You don't have to be a macho man to be, you could be a, like they had bros for Kamala, but this one was, you don't have to be one of these, hardline patriots to vote for Kamala. You can shove that off. And the guy is staring at his horse. They've got these strange white men out in tromping around in the woods. That it was the most ineffective, garbled. It was what they did was they put up this fake person, this straw person, and then they said, don't do this. But since it wasn't, since it was based in media fantasy, they never got to any authenticity about it. So it sounded a lot like, your critique of the Julia Roberts one. But those simply don't work. It insults voters, and it's based on a kind of a false view of the electorate and the reasons why they're voting based on pollings, which of course we know is about the way you ask the questions, not if you ask the right questions, or think about the material sources of the discontent, why people would move to Trump, right? So this needed to be a change election, and nothing they said addressing the needs and issues of the working class came out. They didn't message it, and instead they stayed in this kind of faux cultural realm, of identity. And once again, it didn't work because it's not getting to the sources and issues as to why people really vote for candidates.
Yeah, can I just take, I'll just add, I mean, I think Trump won the white women votes by white women, I think by 8%. 8%.
51%.
Harris won, had got more votes from women overall, but she overwhelmingly won among African American and Latino women. But Trump had a narrow edge, or not a narrow, 8-point edge among white women. And as you suggested, Toby, there were all these referenda about enshrining rights to abortion in states around the country. There were a number of them, and they overwhelmingly passed. Even in states like Florida, where the referendum failed, it was because the Florida state legislature had installed a requirement that you had to reach a supermajority in order to change the
60%.
Constitution, and so it got 57%. The abortion referendum got 57%. And didn't make the 60% cutoff, but 57% of that very conservative state, which Trump won by substantial margins, voted to protect a woman's right to an abortion. I speculate, and again, I don't know this. This is something that political scientists will figure out, in future years, I'm sure, as they dig into this election, that the white women felt like their reproductive rights were sort of protected and insulated in a way that women of color maybe did not. And so, they were willing to vote for Trump, even though they support, they support a woman's right to an abortion. And support reproductive rights because they feel like, okay, yeah, he's going to put in right-wing judges that might curtail abortion rights, but that's not going to affect me, or it's not going to affect my daughters. It's not going to affect my friends. I think they're going to be they're sadly mistaken, because I think one of the effects of this election is going to be that Donald Trump will install at least two, possibly three new Supreme Court justices. And, we saw Roe v. Wade overturned. I am nervous that what we could see is Griswold, which established the Griswold versus Connecticut, which established the right to birth control, overturned. There are some in Trump's orbit, including J.D. Vance, who would like to see, an unlimited right to contraception curtailed. And I think if that happens, there will be, of course, a big backlash. They'll lose the midterms by landslide, by a landslide, because women will turn out and vote Republicans out for being complicit with that. But I do think that this is now a real danger. So it might have been that white women miscalculated in voting for Trump, thinking that it wasn't going to affect their reproductive, the rights to control their own bodies.
Yeah, I think, and I agree with everything that Robin and Steve have said. And I think this commercial obviously was speaking to the giant elephant of sexism, which was a major part of this election. I don't think you can tell the story of this election without it. I think the problem, there's a couple of issues here, though, related to it. I think one of the problems is the way in which this ad talks about sexism. I have noticed, and maybe this is because I teach a lot of history courses and write about history, that it seems like a lot of like leftist critiques of sexism and racism seem to communicate acts of sexism and racism that were a part of yesteryear. And so the husband telling the wife how to vote, that may make sense in like earlier mid 20th century sexism. That's not to say sexism is gone today. I think it just is what do you call it? Shows itself in different ways. And I think saying like husband telling the wife how to vote, I think it's one, very dismissive of women who are married out there, number one. But number two, that's not, I don't think, the way that sexism, people are experiencing sexism in the 21st century for the most part. So I think it was a missed opportunity to speak to a real issue in a past way. It's like speaking about racism with like segregated lunch counters today. Like racism does exist, but the segregated lunch counter is not like the big issue that anti-racists are fighting against. And so I kind of got that vibe from the ad. I do also think that we should tread lightly, though, about talking about the role of sexism in this election. I mean, I think, again, there are people in this country who do vote for women in positions of power. There's some people who possibly never will. The way we talk about what Kamala's wearing, or her laugh, or how she talks, or whether or not she has kids. I mean, I think these are all hallmarks of sexism that a commercial would have been more well served to focus upon, versus this supposed husbands who are telling their wives what to do. But I think
could I just respond to that? Because I sort of disagree with you, Nolan.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah,
because I think that if you look, 81% of white evangelical Christians voted for Trump. And it is in that community that there has been this resurgence of traditional marriage and traditional wives, and this conception of women as a helpmate, right, to their husbands, and where women's submission to their husbands has become part of the theology, right, of white evangelical Christianity. And the reason I mention this is I just read this article in this month's Nation magazine, which is all about, right, this burgeoning of a kind of neo-Christian misogyny that is, that it sort of frames itself in the same language as like self-help. They have manuals for women about how they can be good, subordinate, submissive Christian wives. They have courses about it. And, speaking of new media, right, the trad wife, right, is this huge new media trend. There are all these traditional wife bloggers and Instagram influencers and so on. So I think that there are women right, who have been taught by the sort of evangelical Christian Protestant industry, because it is an industry, that they need to subordinate themselves to their husbands and do what their husbands tell them. That's the Christian and godly thing to do. I think that there's a significant number of women in this country, not maybe not huge, but a significant number who have that view. And so I don't think it's completely anachronistic, is what I'm saying.
Okay, it may not be, yeah, completely, but I mean, I would want to see some more evidence that there's this great like vote shifting of wives from pressure of husbands out there, and even the trad wife, even though I have a similar interpretation as you, I also feel very uncomfortable telling these folks they're brainwashed into making these decisions. That's something like I won't do that, but the
As someone who was raised religious, I don't have any problem saying they've been brainwashed.
I was too. I'm a survivor as well.
That's the difference between you and me. I was raised religious. They have not. They were brainwashed.
But I think
I'll say it. I'll say it.
And there's another element at play here too, though, that I wanted to bring up as well, which is and I think I think we've talked about sexism, rightfully so, from the right, but I think there's also an angle on the left where they take entire like identity voting blocks and they try and reduce them down to one issue, right? So Latinos, immigration's their issue. Blacks, criminal justice reforms, their issue. Women, abortion's their issue. The truth is, we're all humans. We have a priority list of different needs, and people put some needs over others. There appears to be some women who possibly put abortion under other priorities. There are people from the Latino community who put Trump's racist statements and anti-immigrant sentiment under immigration. And to push it back the other way, there are people who look at Democrat voters for Harris and say, like, that's great, you wanted your first woman of color, but we see you as supporting the genocide. You prioritize that over that. So I think there's also a mistake, and we say, like, well, if you either vote for abortion or against it, you're a sexist or non-sexist. People have different priorities that explain where they are. I'm in an economic position where, to be honest, voting for Trump would have helped my economic situation, but there were a bunch of other priorities I put ahead of that make I would never vote for Trump. So there's just different people have different priorities, and I don't think we should reduce all women and abortion down to sexism litmus test.
Good. So it's interesting that you should reference that article, Steve, because I saw it too. It reminded me very much of the 1980s with Susan Faludi's book called Backlash. So
yeah.
We've been there. It's like so many other things we've already experienced this stuff. But if you recall, the television of the 1980s, do you remember 30 something, where it was back to these traditional households, and it was appealing to baby boomer generations, and it was based on a marketing by this marketing woman who was trying to push this idea of a nest that she could sell a whole bunch of products by, and her name was Popcorn. That was her name. And
yes, was it Faith Popcorn or something like
Faith
that?
Popcorn.
I remember she was like a marketing and PR guru. Yeah, no, I remember.
What a country! What a country! At least you bastards were born there and had no choice about it. What about we fuckers who decided to become citizens?
So we've been there and we've done that, and it didn't last a whole long time, but long enough. I think that the Democrats made a lot of mistakes around the issue, and one of the things that didn't come up much, but the Democrat, it's kind of and there's people that we would talk to. Everybody knows that the Democrats could have codified Roe v. Wade years ago. They could have made sure that they did what you were talking about, Steve. They could have made it basically, they could have solidified it. Right. And I think that Nolan is right in that there's a lot of multi-factors, but when you were talking, Nolan, it reminded me of Lucha working in Arizona, and you said Latinos, and we haven't talked about immigration yet, and I don't want to really change the subject unless we want to stay on the women's topic for a while, but we can come back. But Latinos in or Latinx people in Arizona, they said that the three top things that they wanted, that they were concerned with, was not immigration. It was housing, jobs, and healthcare. And I think, messaging is also about, lifestyle and identity and who you message and how you define those groups somewhat simplistically. But ultimately, for women and the working class, what we're talking about are entrenched forces that will not allow real change in this country. And I think the neoliberal agenda was actually on display in so many ways in this election. And nobody was talking about it, and certainly not the Democrats.
No, and let me just say on housing, I was stunned. This is where Kamala Harris was running against a like notorious slumlord real estate developer. She could have made, right? She could have made hay on the housing issue. But her housing plan was just idiotic. Like she was going to give everybody $25,000 towards a down payment. She never talked about, right, the government, the US government, the state building new housing.
Right.
This is the solution if you have a market dysfunction, right? If you have a market that is unable to meet demand, and with housing, we have had in the United States, in major cities, a
Right.
serious market dysfunction for 20 plus years. The response to it ought to be, and what happens in Europe and places like Sweden and Spain and so on, is the government moves in to fill the void and builds affordable housing. She never mentioned it because that would have upset the real estate industry, and she wasn't about to suggest doing anything like that. Trump, of course, didn't even address the issue. He just sort of promised he's going to address inflation somehow without really spelling out any plan besides putting tariffs on 20% tariffs on imported goods, which would only drive up prices by 20%. But Harris really just like completely dropped the ball. That I was sort of astounded because it's a big issue in states. She could have maybe won some of those swing states if she had had a plan for addressing housing, and she really didn't.
But
Can I
that's
ask
what
you
I'm
guys?
thinking
Sorry,
throughout
go
her.
ahead.
Sorry, I'll just, is she never had an overall plan. She would say one thing and then the next. About Gaza, she would say, I'm not Joe Biden. I'm not the same person. Then when she goes on The View, they said, what would you criticize her to do about Joe Biden, or how would you do things differently? And she said nothing. So she never had an overall vision, and certainly and particularly one based in the real economic forces that would change people's lives, be it systemic sexism, systemic racism, housing, all kinds of things. So she didn't have a vision. Toby, what would you want to say? Sorry.
I wanted to ask a general question about the economy because all the exit polls say it was the number one issue. And it was the number one issue big time for Latinas and Latinos in terms of how they voted. It nearly took Nolan's vote. And here's my query. Go back over the first Trump administration, biggest tax cut imaginable for the wealthy, redistribution of income upwards, amateurish next to Clinton and Obama, but, effective, but nonetheless. And, a guy who inherited daddy's money and blew it and is a cheat and a multiple business failure. So there's a part of me that's, Toby Miller at 22, before he had heard of things like cultural studies. And there's this drumbeat that comes at me in the middle of the night. And it's a term we can't use. False consciousness. We're not allowed to say it, are we?
No, I think it's a great point. I'll tie what you're asking there to a little bit about what Robin and Steve were just talking about. But I think it's always a bad sign when you're the party in power and you're trying to convince voters the economy is good. I mean, that's already a bad sign. Voters typically tend to know these things, so that was already alarm bells for me. But I do think there is some there's some truth in the confusion, basically, from my understanding, which is roughly about 50% of Americans have some sort of stocks, some money invested in the so-called market. And there is an inflation crisis in this country. Some may call it a price gouging crisis. I'll let folks out there listening decide. But point being, what's called inflation, sometimes incorrectly, did raise the price of goods. Things like groceries we saw were like 35% increase over 4 years. But if you had your money invested in the market, you could offset those inflationary losses. But for the poor, the majority of Americans who don't have stocks, they're just getting killed. And so I think this is why so many Democrats said the market's doing better, because in their lived experience, it is. The market was doing better if you had those stocks. But for a lot of other folks, it was not. But here's why this really boring economic explanation I think is critically important. Is right now that a lot of people in the consulting class are doing everything they can to run from the economic explanation, and they're talking about how it was woke. She shouldn't have ran on trans issues. She didn't have real woke rhetoric. Or there's the really bad consultants. This is where I was going earlier when I was talking to Steve about sexism, who read from the outcome, they're like, well, women keep losing for our party, so maybe we shouldn't run women. It's like, that's the exact wrong message to take from the election. But that's what the consultants are saying now. Like, we stop running women. And I think it speaks to, and this, speaking of things like false consciousness that Toby was just mentioning, I think it speaks to something Robin said about how neoliberalism bakes these challenges in the cake. Because what did neoliberals promise, right? We were going to achieve the goals of social justice without Marxism. We were going to do it through individualism and through the market. And to me, what I saw when I looked at that map on election night was this is the eradication of any notion of Marxism amongst the voting population. There wasn't that labor organized base. There wasn't that church community base. Toby's writing a class dismiss shirt with Marx on it. And that organizing base wasn't there. And that made those folks a lot easier to be picked up by the right. So I do happen to really agree with Robin on this, that neoliberalism sets up the framework for these systems to fail, even though a lot of us on the left would share the same goals, right? A lot of the goals of DEI and racial justice that neoliberals speak about, but the methodology in which they seek to achieve it actually undermines those very goals.
I think that's really important. Robin, go ahead.
There's a political aspect to this. Okay, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren in 2016 and 2020 redid the dialogue and brought in social justice issues, economics. Bernie wrote the post-election thing. The Democrats abandoned the working class for corporate America. So we got as you were. Was it you, Steve, who was pointing out, we got rid of those in the primary. We got rid of those people in the primary. So the centrist Democratic Party has completely alienated every leftist. Nolan, you and I were talking about that, the last time we were speaking on a panel, that there's really not a coherent left. And when we look at this election and people are saying, yeah, we've got to get rid of women and we've got to go this other direction, that we should be doing exactly the opposite. So what happened when Joe Biden got to power? He ran as the sensible guy, and he didn't have anybody in the Congress or any effective tools to articulate even he was kind of called in his first term, and indeed he did some really good things to reinstitute the welfare state. And he was talking about, the new New Deal, that he would do the New Deal, and he did bolster those kinds of things, but he didn't have anybody in the Congress, or that is to say, he didn't have enough support or language to put that through because of the way they had been running elections and moving the Democratic Party closer and closer to some strange center that I don't know. If you could explain it to me, that would help, because I don't really know what they think they're doing now. But by the second half of his term, he went to the usual stuff of being a fiscal policy, where he was worrying about the deficit. And you're absolutely right to talk, who was then, were the Democrats talking to? Of course, they were talking about the people who they care about, which are the corporations and the wealthy people who finance their campaigns, tell them how to run their campaigns, and then they do that. And then there's it kind of builds this wall around this bubble that they remain in, and they completely don't even know what people need or want anymore. And they actually believe that the economy is good and it's good for the stock market.
Yes, I mean they brag about Bidenomics and and the success of Biden's economic plan. I mean, I think that really rang false for a lot of voters, especially a lot of working class voters, as Nolan said, maybe people who had their money invested in the stock market, rentiers and so on. They felt like they were doing fine. Everybody else since 2020, there has been 21% inflation. That's according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics own, inflation calculator. 21% increase in prices. There has not been a corresponding increase, right, in wages. And so that alone is enough to sink, a candidate. And the reason people didn't show up for Harris is, Harris did the working class people and union members did not show up for Harris is because Harris didn't give them anything right to vote for. She didn't run on, we're going to implement $18 minimum wage around the country. We're going to implement, paid family and medical leave. She did not, right, fight for those things.
And Biden didn't either. He didn't
Yeah,
get
he
the
didn't either.
child tax credit
He had a
last.
child. He did. I mean, I have to say, if you look at some of the things the Biden administration did do for workers and working class people, he had the most pro-labor NLRB that
That's
we
true.
have had probably since Johnson, right? I mean, since LBJ, which is something. It wasn't enough to reverse all of the declines that organized labor, all of the defeats that organized labor,
But it's
right,
huge.
has endured. They weren't able to pass the PRO Act, which would have implemented what's called card check certification, where members of employees of a company can simply sign a union card, and if the union collects a majority of cards, they automatically certify the union as a collective bargaining agent. That would have made it much, much easier to organize. And it's something that left-wing, members of the Squad and AOC and so on were pushing for, and Biden dragged his feet on. And frankly, conservative Democrats in the Senate, like, blockaded, right? They weren't going to go that far, right? And empower workers by making it easier to organize unions. And so, I think that's part of the explanation for why Harris wasn't able to mobilize workers, is she didn't have much to offer them. And, yes, the Biden administration did some things, but it wasn't enough, especially in light of 21% inflation.
I'm more even a little more. I totally agree with you, Steve. I'm even a little more cynical though than you on that issue. I've heard this my whole life, and it's funny that Toby started out the podcast with this talking about blue dog Democrats. The Democrats always try and find some boogeyman to blame for the fact they can't deliver for people. And so it's like, well, the blue dogs, they want to save their seat, but then they always vote against the progressive legislation and lose anyways. That's what happened with the Affordable Care Act, right?
Right.
That's what happened with like the $15 minimum wage, the child tax credit, the Joe Manchin stuff. Like the Democrats always, I think, choose these boogeymen to blame it on because they know that the whole party really doesn't want to support the legislation, right?
I agree. I mean, I think they use them. They point to them as, like we'd love to pass this, but we have to satisfy Joe Manchin.
I wanted to
Thank God they don't have that excuse anymore.
To the working class, which funds them and gives them money, and that's it. Those are their constituents.
Moving off the D word for a moment and onto the R word, if we could. The party of flip-flopping.
Economic, yes.
I finally migrated to the US, having lived there several times before. But when I finally migrated, the R word was the party opposed to deficits. The D word soon became its partner in that, but the R word was vociferous about this, and part of its success in the midterms during Clinton's first presidency was due to hammering this point, and it continued to do so forever. Now, it doesn't care about deficits, they don't matter. The second thing about it was that having been an isolationist party so dramatically and so appallingly in terms of global security in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, it became an inverted commas liberal internationalist party, picking up the reins from the horrors created by the Democrats in the American war in Vietnam. Now it's isolationist again. These are two gigantic changes, really just in the last decade. Don't care about deficits, totally opposed to military intervention.
Right.
They've just appointed or are seeking to appoint a Secretary of Defense who's a failed mid-ranking military official, the kind that leads coups in the global south historically, and who says that the problem with the military is, of course, that there are too many women and too many people of color and too much interest in queer politics, and of course, most importantly, too much anxiety about being the worst polluter in world history. So what about these flip-flops? Are they real? Am I imagining them? And if they're real, how do they get away with this? And why are they not attacked head on by everyone from Rachel Maddow to Kamala Harris?
I just want to talk about the deficit, although I should talk about the sadder one. But when I said that in the Joe Biden in his second term became a fiscal conservative, he started, the Democrats started worrying about the deficit. The reason the Republicans were always worried about the deficit is because they were building false false consciousness among their working class people, their supposed constituents, when really their constituents are corporate, are corporate wealthy, when there was always the justification for they couldn't reduce taxes. They couldn't reduce taxes on the working class because of the deficit. And so every time, so we used to, believe it or not, in this country in the 70s, even up towards the 80s, we had a progressive tax scale. Not one that became corporations pay no taxes and all the rest of us are the ones who pay for all this military. So that is why the deficit, when Trump came in and he wanted to do tax breaks everywhere for the wealthy, then nobody cared about the deficit anymore. So those are messaging. They again wrapped up in the false consciousness of their own messaging.
Can I just make a quick comment about Toby's question about this flip-flopping? It doesn't really surprise me because it's the story of American politics in the last like 60 or 70 years. You know, in the US, we have very weak political parties. They are vehicles for candidates, not for ideologies, not for platforms. So it's very unlike, you know, what you have in Europe in a parliamentary system where what matters is the platform. I can guarantee you nobody in the Trump White House is going to look back at his platform, the platform he put together, or the platform of the Republican Party, just as there's never, when Democrats are in power, they never look back at what was on the platform, right? Platforms don't matter. It's these parties are vehicles for candidates, and so a particularly popular candidate like Donald Trump can stage an insurgency and take over, right? I mean, just 20 years ago, the Republican Party was under the control of neoconservatives who wanted to wage imperial war all over the globe. Right? In Afghanistan, Iraq, you name it. And Wolfowitz and Cheney were calling the shots, in foreign policy. And they were very, very concerned about like making sure we had, robust defense spending, but wanted to cut everywhere else in the budget. Donald Trump doesn't have that same philosophy. He wants to have the largest, he wants to build on Joe Biden's like nearly $900 billion Pentagon budget. He's going to, this Trump's election all but guarantees we will have $1 trillion military, where the budget for the military will be $1 trillion a year. And it's going to make the world a lot more dangerous because he's going to build more nuclear weapons. He did that when he was in power last time, and he's going to ramp that up. So he wants to have a strong military, but he's not particularly interested in being the policeman for the world, the way that, that the traditionally the Republican Party was committed to, right? Like 20 years ago. And he certainly is not, I mean, it's very interesting to look at how, if I follow a lot of the financial media, the way the financial media is talking about like what long-term bond rates are looking like, because they don't anticipate Donald Trump to exercise any kind of fiscal restraint or responsibility whatsoever. He's going to spend like a drunken sailor on whatever programs he wants. And so, the deficit will only get higher. And I'm not against deficits, because deficit is just another word for investment. But I'm against deficits when it's going to, build like a giant war machine, or to subsidize, drilling for oil and natural gas on in national park land, which is what's going to happen under Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I agree, and I won't reiterate too much of what was said here, but I do think there's two things going on that Robin and Steve spoke to, and one is that a lot of what you're talking about as far as flip-flopping is age-old American politics. Like, deficits matter to Republicans when Democrats are in power. Ronald Reagan quadrupled the deficit. Look at the Bush years, who was the drunk kid with the credit card, all those kinds of things. So I think that's not too abnormal. I think there is this so-called new right, on the conservative right, that's kind of interesting. It's folks like Marco Rubio and JD Vance, who actually do believe in government spending, but for right-wing purposes. So like their way of solving, for example, the lack of like traditional heteronormative families is to have like a child tax credit, because they think that'll incentivize more women to have children. So they see like spending domestically like that. There's a debate though about foreign policy. Marco Rubio is a prime example of this. He's really changed to kind of the new right in some domestic policy spaces, but he's still a neocon on foreign policy, and that's put him at some tension with the MAGA folks.
And he's going to be Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, rumor has it, yeah. And then and that isolation question comes in, right? Like Trump campaigned as the anti-war peace candidate, which was hilarious. And I think Harris, actually helped support that false narrative by calling him an isolationist. Look at what he did. Blanking on his name, from Iran. Soleimani, when he assassinated him, or threatens nuclear war with North Korea. I mean, those are not isolationist actions. So I don't think he is an isolationist. And then the last thing I'll say is we are in a realignment period. So a lot of these things I think we're discussing that seem like historically abnormal, this could become the new norm if these parties are able to conclude they have a winning strategy with this coalition and can maintain that coalition. And I know it seems really weird to think like, are you telling me the Republicans are going to be like a multicultural working class party? That could be. I don't know if that will bear out in the future, but I'll say that crazier things have happened. In 1936, let's not forget, young black voters switched to the white supremacist Democrat Party and were, just chided and lambasted for it. But within 12 years, they got something in the platform about civil rights. They got a vote on it less than a decade later, and then they got it into law less than 10 years after that. So these things can happen. Perhaps we're in a realignment period, Toby, and maybe that explains some of the inconsistencies. But
it could be. And Marco Rubio, I think it's more likely he'll be nominated for Secretary of State rather than Defense. But we'll see.
Sorry, I meant Secretary of State.
Right. But that brings us back to something Robin started with. I'd like to hear more about foreign policy, certainly Gaza, but also Ukraine, for example, Sudan, Yemen, and the magical family Middle East policy that was so brilliantly successful before.
Yes. Well, so, I mean, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, is doubtless going to play a key role in shaping like Mideast policy in the Trump White House. And, he's very close with MBS, with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So that doesn't really bode well for Yemen. And I mean, in fact, he's gotten even closer since he left the first Trump White House, right? Since Trump was last president, because Jared Kushner started this, investment fund, and got $7 billion from the sovereign wealth fund in Saudi Arabia, invested in his investment fund. So he's got like his economic interests are intertwined with the autocratic monarchy in Saudi Arabia. Um, and then I noted when we were talking before the start of the show that Trump has just announced that Mike Huckabee is going to be the new ambassador to Israel. Mike Huckabee, who has been an occasional candidate for president, was former governor of Arkansas, but was also like a sort of evangelical minister who believes absolutely crazy things about how we are approaching the end times. And he's been very interested in Israel his whole career. Apparently, he leads visits of born again Christians, takes born again Christians on tours of Israel. This guy is now going to be in charge of relations between the U.S. and Israel. So we should all be very, very afraid. It's time to start digging up those old tapes about duck and cover because, no, because, because I mean it's absolutely terrifying. And he also is just incredibly contemptuous, right, of Palestinian rights, and claims to sovereignty. He has said on the record that he does not believe there is such a thing as the Palestinian people, and he is an opponent of any kind of two-state solution.
Yeah,
So,
well, for is that we don't have to look, at Jared Kushner, right? But that's a very good point. But look at what Trump did when he was in the
oh
White House. He
yeah.
moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and he instituted the Abraham Accords, which was a very dramatic and radical change in foreign policy, in which those kinds of diplomatic agreements always took into consideration the Palestinians, and with those bilateral things they did not. And those are one of the things that Hamas talked about, the reasons that they felt so disbanded, ignored, erased, that they carried out October 7th. So, but if we look historically at defense spending, if you will, Pentagon spending, what we find is it's consistent historically ever since World War II, where we didn't learn the lessons of what it took us to get rid of Hitler. We bombed civilians, we did everything, and we increased defense spending by 3 times, and it's been that way ever since. There was a small peace dividend under Clinton, if you recall that, when things were pretty good, but it's ultimately continually going up with both parties. It's something that is never debated. It is, if there's one issue in American society and culture that is singularly never debated, it's defense spending. And and you've got Elon Musk there. It's a complete myth that Elon Musk is a self-made, entrepreneur, and he's got all his money from Tesla, because he is a product of the defense spending industry as well, where his Starlinks have been sold and supported by the Pentagon. And that was it. That was, they were utilized very much in the Ukraine war, the war, our defense of Ukraine. So I think all of there's no hope that anything different is going to happen with the Middle East and Gaza. I wish I could say that it would stop, but sadly I don't think it will. There is, and I'd like to hear everybody talk about this. He has said he hates NATO, Donald Trump. He said he's gonna. People have been saying, look, if there's any hope that the war in Ukraine could end, it would be Donald Trump. So, and he doesn't like NATO. So I don't know how that's going to play out, but if anybody else has an idea, I'd like to hear it.
Do you think that Lockheed Martin and Raytheon et al. Are going to let him abandon NATO? I don't think so. And I think that you make a really great point about Elon Musk's ties to the defense industry and to the Pentagon. He owns 3 different companies that are contractors with the Pentagon.
Yeah.
Three different companies. And yes, he wouldn't be like there are several times where the US government via defense spending has bailed out some of Elon Musk's ventures. And so I'm not optimistic that his new this, he's been appointed by Trump to head this new Department of Government Efficiency, Doge. I am not, I am not, I am not at all optimistic that Doge is going to address wasteful Pentagon spending, or do things like cut the multi-billion-dollar boondoggle, the F-35. They're not going to do anything like that.
They're
What
going to
Well,
call
they're,
social
what are
code.
they,
That's
they
all.
will they will not address the elephants in the room, which are all these hyper expensive, inefficient, dysfunctional weapons programs. I mean, the
Elon Musk,
F-35 still can't operate 50% of the time, and this is what the New York Times has called the $1 trillion weapon. It's the first weapons program that total is going to cost $1 trillion. It's still not functional half of the time.
Was
So
Elon Musk though said that his biggest problem with the inefficiency of government was it had too many agencies, and so they created a new
yeah, so
agency
just
for him.
all
And
unite them into one.
As Elizabeth Warren pointed out, it's really inefficient to have him run as a co-position for a position that's for
Right,
one person. That's really
right.
inefficient because him
It
and Vivek
is.
Ramaswamy are running the new administration.
the
One
It
of the
only
sounds
things
like
that
it sounds like the treatment for like it sounds like the premise for like a sitcom.
It does, doesn't it?
one of the
Toby, I
things
just
that
want to
people
bring one thing up before we end, and that is what we haven't talked about is that Trump has threatened to basically fire all of the federal employees. So civil service, so career people who know how to run this government in every aspect of the way that it's run, civil servants and career diplomats and career foreign, all of those people, he's going to, and he may well replace them with his cronies. There's nothing more indicative of corrupt governments than that. And I think we're really, if he does that, we're really looking forward to a kind of a corrupt, grinding poverty, third world kind of experience in this country that I don't think anybody has really imagined.
Well, this is why I know we're talking about Republicans, but this is why I think we keep coming back to the Democrats, because we can all talk for hours or write long essays or books on the ridiculousness of MAGAism and what Donald Trump says it is. But then you always have to come back to the question, well, then, like, what is so wrong with the Democrats that this keeps winning? I mean, that's the Democrats. I mean, it's more, to me, it's always more of an indictment of the Democrats when you talk about the absurdity of Republicans, that really you can't find someone to beat this guy. Like that,
Yeah.
in a nation of 330 million people, you can't do that. That's astounding.
Right. And over again, they were told they were going to lose the election if they kept going with the genocide over and over and over again. And they chose that. They chose to risk the election. It's always the Democrats to lose. And we saw it one more time.
Folks, to
Okay.
wind things up, I wondered if I could invite each of you, pardon me, to make a final statement. Maybe again go in alphabetical order. So Nolan, then Robin, then Steve. Does that sound okay?
Sure. Yeah, my advice would be, I'm sure it's dark days for those of us who claim to lean left and in the progressive space coming out of the election, but in the vein of like a Rahm Emanuel, we shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste. We only get two parties in this country. I think the Democrats are looking quite weak, and I think this is an opportunity for leftists to make the right moves to take this over. That necessitates not only turning out once every 2 or 4 years to vote, but doing some organization, building some community, buying into that collectivism, engaging with and developing new media systems. I think it's all on the table right now. And if I'm a lefty, this is kind of an exciting opportunity in terms of building an opposition against the conservative right here, with a Democratic Party that's weakened. And I think it's actually soul searching for answers. I've been astounded how radical some of the critiques in corporate media have sounded of the Democratic Party. Don't waste that. Act now. Don't fall back into the same habits that got us here. That'd be my advice.
I agree with Nolan. I think that this has presented an incredible opportunity. I think the organizations that I've kind of am involved with, you know, at least on the edges, there we understood that this election wasn't going to bring about either way what we needed. If it was going to be Harris, and if it was going to be Trump, we would still have our work cut out for us the following morning. So I know that some people were saying, just think about which party you would rather fight against, right? And people think, well, the Democrats, but we do have failed to move the Democratic Party, you know, all this time. So maybe them actually opting out of the picture and really coalescing around an agenda that addresses, that's broadly coalition and about multiple topics to go vertically and horizontally. I think that is, you know, I like Nolan's point, and I think that's what I'll stick with too.
I mean, I agree that the left has to get its act together and to figure out how how to influence the Democratic Party, if not take it over. And the beautiful thing about our completely corrupt, bankrupt political system in the U.S., the two-party duopoly, is that the parties are so weak that, especially at the local level, progressive left-wing activists, labor activists can take over. There is a group called the Working Families Party that is trying to organize and will be organizing resistance against what is coming. And I just think we shouldn't sugarcoat what is coming. There's going to be a massive assault on civil liberties. There is going to be, Donald Trump has already promised to enact vengeance against his political enemies. He is going to pack the Supreme Court with right-wing justices who will impede progressive social change, at least legislatively, for decades to come. We shouldn't kid ourselves. This is really, really bad, and it's going to get worse. And there will be no action on, on addressing the sources of global climate change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as Robin said, the federal bureaucracy, including agencies that are sort of vital like FDA, EPA, et cetera, are going to be hollowed out and replaced with Trump cronies. We should be terrified. We should organize to resist, and not just resist legislatively and, at the level of policy, but also resist in the streets through protests and demonstrations and other means. We just heard, it was just announced that Donald Trump is nominating Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. This is just astounding because, for your listeners, Matt Gaetz has been accused of sex trafficking, illicit drug use. He's subject to a federal investigation, which I assume will end if he becomes Attorney General.
That's the man we're looking for.
Regarding these matters, he's also the subject of a House Ethics Committee investigation about allegations of sexual misconduct and illicit drug use. And this is the person Trump is nominating as Attorney General. It's stunning, but I mean it's a master stroke. In any case, but yeah, that's what I would say. We have to resist, and we also have to organize to maybe try to take over the Democratic Party.
That's a good headline, Steve. Kemi Badenoch, who is the newly elected leader of the Conservative Party in Britain and first black woman to be leader of a political party in the UK, has said that 10% of the bureaucracy must be imprisoned immediately without indicating who or why or through what process. At least Mr. Trump is just wanting to fire people who are in those positions. But I'm sure he wants to imprison a heck of a lot more. Yeah. So many thanks, Steve, Robin, Nolan, for your wonderful contributions in general to our intellectual and political lives, but also in terms of today. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be talking to you guys, and I thank you very, very much. Even as I think about 10% in jail versus all career bureaucrats being fired, and I think at least I'm in Spain. But then I think, oh, I'm not allowed to live here after August. So in any event, many, many, many thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Ew.
Thanks, Toby.